I am Al Adamsen, and I am responsible for this thing if it goes poorly. And if it goes really well, I have a laundry list of people to thank. So the buck stops here. Unlike some, I am responsible. So I say that from a very humble and grateful place. So what I'm going to do this morning is go through what I believe is the big reset for people analytics and have it set the stage, not only for the balance of the day, but for the event. And I didn't want to do it yesterday because we had Thomas Rasmussen and Sally Smith from NAB in Australia, and that time worked out really well. So you can imagine us putting this program together, playing Tetris with all these sessions and all these people from around the world, and grateful to all of them. As I mentioned, whenever I present publicly, while I am the founder and CEO of PAFOW, I am ultimately a parent. I am the father of two wonderful children. That tall dude is sleeping right over there, about 10 feet past a couple walls, so we have a hallway in between us. Yes, I am upset that he is taller than me. I don't remember us being the same height, but he is a wonderful human being, as is his younger sister, Ave. And they are the joys of my life. And the work that I do personally, and I believe the work that we do collectively with people, data, analytics, AI, will affect them. And so what I am doing is for them in that respect. And I believe most everyone in the discipline that I've come across over the last nearly 20 years has had a similar sense of responsibility. So I say that up front because I want us to enter in with eyes wide open. I want you to know who I am. I will also add on the people analytics front, I had the great fortune of creating the capability at Gap Inc. Here in San Francisco in the early 2000s, that have since worked with a technology company and consulting for firms both large and small. And I've had the great fortune of advising and educating some of the most prominent practitioners and firms in the world. So, again, I say that from a very humble place and grateful place. And, what I'm going to share is largely on the shoulders of what they have shared and provided to the community over the years. So without being dramatic, this is what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the big reset. Let me mumble that again. The big reset. By the way, if you don't know, because I didn't say it explicitly, it's 1:03 a.m. for me. So if I stumble or slur, just know that I'm asking my body to do things it doesn't normally do. That's stare at 3 glowing rectangles at 1 in the morning with a bunch of lights on to make it look like daytime. But here are the big reset for people analytics that I see. And it's honoring the human experience. And again, I'm going to speak to each of these, not in great detail. I'm just going to, frankly, go over them rather quickly because I want David and I to enter into some discussion, and there's going to be a deeper explanation of each of these dimensions in an article that I will put out by the end of this week, with the goal of making David's list. If I don't make David's list, my feelings get hurt. So rise of the platforms, much to say about that. Appropriate questions, appropriate data. David and I touched on that, as we did the privacy and ethics and what I'll call the human contract. Continuous listening to continuous dialogue. Perpetual work design, which if you understand what that means right now, then good on you. It is something that is probably going to stretch our thinking beyond where it has been historically in this discipline, or any discipline for that matter. And finally, the speed, scale, and sustainability of people analytics, or not. And I'm going to talk about what I've observed among people analytics teams over the last 2 months. So with that, I want to share 2 slides before I launch into those specifically. And if you've heard me present before, you've not only seen pictures of my kids at various stages, but you've seen this quote. The beginning of wisdom is calling things by their right names, which is a Chinese proverb that has been extremely influential to my thinking over the years, because it's really had me pause on the language that I'm using. And this goes for interpersonal communication to professional communication in our discipline. For example, what is people analytics? What is workforce planning? What is digital transformation? What are we doing now in terms of trying to transform our workforce and listen to our employees and all that? I feel that we're still talking past one another in many cases, and we haven't slowed down and really qualified the language that we're using and in turn the appropriate response. So we're going to talk more about that as we go through. The other thing I want to share to level set, and this is something that is important to me: first who, then what. And it's not only important to me, but it's, if I look at a leading practice or a commonality among those people analytics teams that are doing this work well insofar as they're delivering high value, they're generating impact, they're building positive energy. They've really focused on the who and then designed appropriately after the fact. So when they actually have done that, they have empathized with the individual. Obviously, people are working from home. Teams, there's new dynamics among teams given there's virtual. Groups, as you can be diversity groups, they can be job families, they can be any number of dimensions by location, and then the total org. So these are different dimensions, and oftentimes they all get jumbled together. So if you went to our website, you see this weird thing, you might think it's a typo, ITGO. This is what ITGO stands for: individual team, group, and organizational agility. This is the fact that, hey, we have to be agile as individuals, we have to be agile as teams, groups need to as well, as do organizations en masse. And that's what we're going to talk about as we start to wrap up. So let's jump in. Honoring the human experience. Now, I want to draw a distinction. There's a lot of play, as there well should be, and this is well earned, around employee experience. We've talked about worker experience over the years, where it's not only about the employees in an organization, but it's about workers. There's contractors and others who are contributing to the mission of the organization. They are human beings. They're working together. They're leveraging the technologies. They're generating data. They're generating insight. And there's a host of things that have been overlooked over time. And we're going to, again, talk about those as we go. Because remember this? Remember those times way back when, when we were together having a good time? This will happen again, and we all know it will. We just don't know when. And it's brought out this situation, this visibility that connection matters, that being in someone else's presence and getting a hug and hearing their voice and getting the senses and seeing them in 3 dimensions is beautiful. It's what makes us human, or at least it's one of the great benefits of being human. This has been taken away, and we are all grieving. We all have this sense of loss for that connection, and we're striving for it. And do we really understand it? And do we understand it in accordance with those dimensions? Do we understand what it means to the individual? Different types of individuals? Do we understand what it means to work? Do we understand what it means to groups and certainly the organization? I will give you the answer. The answer is no. We don't understand it. We are starting to get some ideas of what that means. We've gotten some ideas based on the curiosity that we've stayed in to learn. We've asked the questions, we've gathered the data, we've juxtaposed it against other data sets, which is now painting a picture that, yeah, people are struggling. Blair Hopkins yesterday talked about the fact that his calendar has blown up, as has mine. I'm raising 2 kids. He has young kids. Tangibly, Isabel on that panel also had kids. Everyone has kids, so they're juggling. And here's a perfect example. here we are trying to be present for our loved ones while also getting things done and contributing to the organization, while potentially carrying the anxiety that our jobs might not be there next week or next month. And here in the States, we do not have the social uh, support systems that you do in Europe. And the good news is there's greater awareness of the value in that. And I do not want to put forth the idea that the systems that you have are perfect or sufficient to deal with what is before us. However, certainly better than the US, because what's happening in the US has highlighted the disparity of income, of wealth, and just what people have to deal with day to day to survive. And this is true all over the world. So as we go, we're trying to get work done, yet we're also trying to stay connected to our family. And this might be, in this picture, it's an elderly, or I'm sorry, it's a young kid, but it could be an elderly person. It could be anybody, right? So, how do we, we talk about the virtue of being present. Uh, are we able to be present? Oftentimes not. So we have to, you know, accelerate, stop, toggle. And that is really, really hard. I mean, multitasking cognitively cannot happen. Therefore, how are we going to manage this ongoing, and how long, even when we get to the quote unquote new normal, what's that going to look like? And by the way, I didn't highlight it, but this is really happening. We're in the midst of this. Many are talking about in the wake of COVID-19. We're in the midst of it. We're in the thick of it. And so let's keep that in mind. So here's another example for someone at work. He might be an essential worker, might be driving around. He's going to have a different experience than someone working at a grocery, someone who might be teaching at home, someone, of course, a first responder, frontline worker, a nurse in this case, and they're dealing with things that are beyond imagination, the emotional toll it's taking, as well as a psychological toll. I can only imagine what's that like. It's one thing to have that trauma on one instance one day. It's another thing to have it day after day after day. So how is that affecting them? Do we know? Are we asking the questions? Are we giving them space? And I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Meanwhile, we got to put food on the table. We got to do what we do in everyday life. And in some cases, we're teaching our kids. And while I don't want to leave it as dire, this is also a wonderful time for communication and connection with those that we love. And I hear story after story of how this time has afforded people to come together with those that matter in their lives. So there is much beauty in this. That being juxtaposed with the harsh realities that we're dealing with, it's a tough go. So we have to continue to stay in curiosity, and I'm going to get to that when we talk about continuous dialogue. So with that, the rise of the platforms, and I'm going to come back to the human experience towards the end, and I'm going to connect a dot there. But right now, the rise of the platforms, and this is probably the most data-centric component of the reset for people analytics, because what has happened over the last 2 months in particular is that organizations have had to take this external data. We've heard it from the Johns Hopkins data set that is representing global data, but certainly once they had county level data here in the US, the consumption of that data by organizations to figure out what was happening in terms of the hotspots relative to the employee base was being used all over. So the ability to consume that data, analyze it, visualize it, and then tell stories and do scenario planning is something that was not the case before. Now we're able to do that quickly because of these platforms. So what you have up here is based on an article I wrote a couple of years ago, People Analytics 3.0, where 1.0 is research and analysis and been around for 100 years. You have psychologists coming in and they'll do a spot survey and figure out what's going on, answer a certain business problem, or test a certain hypothesis. Past 20 years or so, maybe even going back to the mid 90s, when you talk about the emergence of business intelligence solutions, we have this need to data aggregate and visualize the data. And as we were doing that, it became clear that HR data needed something unique because HR data is unique, and particularly when you try and bring it next to cost center data and other data. So over the past 15 years in particular, there have been fantastic tools that have been specifically developed to consume data and publish it next to HR data. And those organizations that have had those platforms in place prior to COVID-19 have, in my view, been able to meet the needs of executives far better in terms of speed and accuracy and just general confidence building than those that have not. Now, there are some exceptions, and that goes, and I'm going to be disciplined and not say names, but I'll come back to that at the end. I'm sure David and I will talk about that in a bit. People Analytics 3.0 is really around the idea that we're creating products based on AI and machine learning. And that has been in vogue for the past several years, as well it should be. There's data all over the place, and to bring it down a level to the team lead or the individual, it was a natural evolution. However, that has been sidelined during this crisis in favor of these platforms. So David Shawns yesterday did a fantastic job talking about what they're doing at Nokia, leveraging a platform to inspire executive decision-making and scenario planning. So now I'm going to accelerate a little bit, and I'm not going to apologize. It's morning. Everyone's going to get their workout. That's totally good with me. So when I started in this field in the early 2000s, it was really about HR analytics or human capital analytics. And I wasn't making many friends walking around halls talking about that. Now we have people analytics, but HR analytics and even workforce analytics, if I go there, was leveraging internal data sets that are listed here. Now, however, we have all these external data sets, what we'll now call people data. So again, these platforms consume all this data, whether it be inside or outside of the organization, to enable unique insights to be generated. So third, appropriate questions, appropriate data. What the heck do I mean by this? Is right now we are collecting data on COVID-19, and that data didn't exist before. We have questions that we're asking about the risks, and that's an appropriate question. We need appropriate data to answer the appropriate question. Historically, we haven't been collecting that. We have to go create that. So I'm highlighting here that if you're in this discipline, you are a supplier of information and insight, and oftentimes you work through a partner. That can be an HR business partner, that can be an executive, that can be a CHRO. Then you go to an end customer. That can be an executive leadership team, a governance body, or someone else. Ultimately, what we want to do is inspire confidence through these stories, these coherent narratives that say, okay, I understand the problem better, therefore I'm going to do this. And to highlight the arrows here, sometimes it's like telephone in fourth grade, if you played that where you grew up, where you tell someone something, and they in turn tell it to another person and on down the line. And then when it comes back, it's different. Like, what the heck happened? So sometimes it go down the bottom, we go directly to that end customer. So there's nothing lost in the translation. And in the middle, sometimes we go with that middle person and present, for example, with them, which arguably is the best case if we're trying to get a group to align around a certain piece of insight. But just being aware that this process exists is really powerful, because again, first who, then what? Who are your customers? Who are your partners? And it might have shifted based on COVID-19. So with that in mind, if you're in a people analytics role, or even if you're not, even if you're a different persona, if you will, in this process, what you might be a partner or an end customer, the people analytics professional has historically been for lack of a better term, content or constrained by the data that they have access to. In other words, that they have not been able to go create the appropriate data. That now has to change, and I emphasize it has to change. It has to change for obvious reasons, is that if they're not involved in the design of processes, if they're not involved in the design of the analytic that are going to be created, then the insights that go downstream are going to be suboptimal or worse, totally disregarded. So let me put an example on this, is the COVID-19 cases in your community or your country. Where do you source that data? Who makes that decision? What other data does it get next to? What are the privacy and analytical rules around that data? So those questions and that discussion has to happen. And who is having it? Who's facilitating it? Who's the decision maker? If questions or if answers to those questions are not clear, then your organization is left behind. So if that is not the case, then initiate the conversation. And as I get to the end, I'm going to draw a clear distinction between companies and people on its team specifically that have done that, are able to meet needs, and those that have not have actually fallen off. So more to share on this as we go. Privacy ethics and the human contract. So this is where it gets a little bit crazy, and this could be a rabbit hole, and I'm not going to let it be a rabbit hole in the interest of time. But I will say this, is that we are going to deal with an ethical challenge that societally that we haven't dealt with before in the history of humankind. Now, GDPR was, in my view, a fantastic first step. I often cite as the EU Commission, and forgive me if I'm not saying it right, we're interviewing Zuckerberg and others around privacy, and the level of questions was beautiful. Fast forward, we need to understand, arguably, who's been exposed, who's at risk. And as you likely know, in China, given the way they collect data, that you have a red, yellow, or green, I don't want to say logo, but representation on your device based on the juxtaposition of whether or not you've been exposed to someone with COVID-19. Now, that approach is not something that's going to be acceptable in Europe or the United States anytime soon. That being said, cell phone data is being used to analyze who has been compliant with social distancing here in the US. And as far as I understand, it might be the case in Europe. I do not know. But as you can see right here, EU data regulator calls for pan-European COVID-19 app. That invites the question, who owns that data? Does the EU own that data? Does the individual own that data? Does the app provider own that data? We don't know. Here's another article. The phone industry explores worldwide tracking of users. So whose data is it at the end of the day? What rights do we as individuals have relative to governments as versus the companies that are collecting this data? Going further, you see the positive output of the digital contract tracing. And it invites the individual to say, okay, let's do this. But what happens step 2, steps 3, steps 4, 6, 12 months from now? What are we going to be exposed to? Who in your organization is having that discussion? I imagine it's legal. I imagine it's the chief privacy officer. Are people analytics professionals involved in that discussion? In my view, we need to be in that discussion. Not only do we need to be in it, we need to lead it. We need to drive it. We need to be educated on the risks and opportunities inherent in what is happening, because this is no longer, oh, we're going to evolve towards this, and it's happening. And again, I thought, and I still believe GDPR was a great first step. I do now look at what's happening in the world, and I'm really curious, particularly given the political climate, where we're going to land on this. So we need to have a voice as a discipline, and we also need to have a voice as a company and as an individual people analytics practitioner or HR leader, where these are the boundaries. This is appropriate. This is not appropriate. So more to share on that, and I'm sure David will ask me a question or two because there's certainly more to share. So continuous listening to continuous dialogue, and there are several sessions on this, so I'm not going to go very deep, but I will say this. We're all at home. It's a struggle for many, particularly as it extends. And so full compassion and care and empathy to everyone out there who's struggling. It's also the case where, as an organization, we're trying to understand, at least we should be, what's happening and what are the constraints, what are some of the things that we as an organization can do to help manage capacity, manage workflow, and all those other things so they can attend to their kids and their partners. So ultimately, what I would say in this, and again, it's been talked about yesterday, and I'm sure it'll be talked about today and ongoing, is that elevating the level of frequency and moving from listening to true dialogue, going back and forth, in other words. But what does that mean? So for me, it means three things. After the basics, we as human beings want to be seen, we want to be heard, and we want to be empowered. So I want to know my organization sees me struggling. And that means I need a path by which to communicate how I'm thinking and feeling, what my situation is. And I need the space to be honest. I cannot do happy talk because that's not going to help me. It's not going to help the organization. And if I do share, I need to feel heard. I need not only to hear that they heard me insofar as they're saying those words back to me, I need to see appropriate action taking place. And ultimately, I want to feel empowered. I want to see potentially my workload decrease so I can give my kids and my partner more attention. I want to see that I am not getting pressured to answer emails at 9 p.m. on a Friday. Whatever the case is, people need to be empowered. They need to have this sense that they're in control at a time where there's not a lot of control, there's not a lot of confidence. And so if we as organizational leaders and HR specifically can help, then good things are going to happen. We're going to build trust, and the resilience that they're going to exhibit is going to be certainly higher than it would be otherwise. I will overlay this too, is that, again, I want to emphasize that some are concerned about their jobs. Some have already lost their jobs. Are you staying in touch with them? Is that appropriate? I would hope it is. How do you do this? I would advocate to truly show you care. We want to practice what I call OQIs, observations, questions, and ideas. This is how I define feedback. So observations are just this: hey, I hear you're doing this. Hey, staying in curiosity and asking more questions systematically at scale. This can be through a survey. Individually, it's just, again, affirmative inquiry, asking some probing questions that will give confidence that you're truly trying to empathize and get a deeper sense of that person's truth. And then ultimately, as opposed to telling somebody what to do, giving them ideas, again, empowering them. And so they can choose what idea to take on, as opposed to being told, okay, this is the should, which never feels good. So again, think about how your overarching construct, and this is something that people analysts can lead, again, through the data that we're collecting and the stories that we tell back. So perpetual work design, and I got two more, and then we'll bring David back in. So I'm actually going to pause for a second as I let you read this. And I would put forth that you may have never seen these definitions on the same page before. All right, I don't imagine you read the whole thing, but you get it. I would ask you, what's the difference? What's the difference? As much as I see distinctions, I am working to defend the definition as opposed to really think that they're different. In my view, they can and should be one and the same thing. And if not, they need to be really, really closely related. Workforce planning is going to affect digital transformation and vice versa. Let's go back to our mother who is struggling with her 3 kids, dog, bunch of toys, phone call, and trying to get something done on the computer. What is her constraint here? Is it her skill level? Does she need to get training? Probably not. Does she not have budget? No, probably not. I mean, that's not a constraint. Who knows? Is it the organizational structure? Is it her workflow? Potentially. But what I would contend is she doesn't have time. Her capacity is tapped out. So if I go to the 4 C's of workforce planning, capability, capacity, cost, and construct, these are all getting disrupted. We're going to have to adjust our learning styles. Agile learning, skill development, rapid skill development, and deployment is certainly, it's a need. It's not a nice to have anymore. But cost, yes, budget constraints coming out of this, certainly. Construct, yes, of course, the workflow, communication strategies. Natasha did a great job yesterday talking about leading practice on virtual teams and ideas. But what I really would like you all to sit with a second is that capacity. We're all constrained now. You talk about work-life balance, work-life integration, whatever you want to call it, it's all jumbled up right now. We are struggling as individuals and as teams and as organizations. We do not know our organizational capacity, and we can find that out through data. So this is something that I evolved in 2007, 2008. And I go back to that crisis. What happened? There was a reduction in employees by organizations. The increased use of consultants and contractors happened, and it happened with outsourced providers as well. Fast forward over the next 6, 7 years, AI started to take hold. So from a revenue per employee perspective, many organizations looked a lot better. But what do you have? You had burnout. You had people who were struggling to, maintain good relationships where they felt that their performance was not fairly rated. There was a bunch of problems that were embedded in systems that are now being acutely highlighted. And now, what is our appropriate response moving forward? Because I believe the same dynamic is happening again. Can we automate some things? Some. But with essential workers and other things, we're not going to be able to automate. So what are we, in fact, going to do? What is going to be our appropriate response? So we're going to come back to this dynamic in the discussion with David. So I've heard it all. I'm sure you have HR transformation, digital transformation, business transformation, IT transformation. It got to be a big yawn. Everyone's transforming. I tried to bring it together in this notion of work transformation. This is where I've been advocating for the past few years, and many organizations, not because of me, but have observed that they were actually evolving to this, where they, okay, what's the work an organization needs to do? Who's going to do that work? Is it going to be employees? Is it going to be contractors? Is it going to be outsourced providers? Is it going to be AI? So thinking about it as one system as opposed to these disparate systems. So here we are, bam, we got this thing, COVID-19. And that's disrupted everything, of course. So this, in my view, is going to require, for lack of a better term, perpetual work design. We have to design that experience of that struggling worker at home. We have to make sure that as things change, we can change with it. And what is going to guide that? Data. It's going to be the risk factors in that region. It's going to be that person's job role. It's going to be the surveys and dialogue that emerges in communication with him or her and groups that that individual is a part. So there's so much that's going to need to be done on an ongoing basis. The idea of workforce planning, okay, I'm going to put together a plan, see how we're doing against the plan. The idea of transformation, having been consulting prior to People Analytics field, it's like, we go through a transformation process, and then we're transformed. Not going to happen. We are transforming continuously, thus the word there, perpetual work design. So that invites the question, who's responsible for that? Is it HR? Is it facilities? Is it IT? Is it operations? In many organizations, we don't have the governance structures in place to answer these questions. The good news is there have been task force that has been spun up, and this is exactly what they're addressing. What are people doing? What can they do? What should they be doing in matter of a priority? And let's make sure that they're resourced to do it. So that as a capability within an organization, in my view, is going to be ongoing. And who better to facilitate that than the person responsible for people strategy and analytics? So finally, speed, scale, and sustainability, or not. So this is a build slide, but in the interest of time, I'm just going to throw it up. Analytics maturity progression. Jonathan Farrar, partner in Insight 222, he and I have a kinship around the fact that we do not like maturity models because maturity models imply that being on the far right is good. Here, I would call it an analytics maturity progression. And the distinction is important because it is just reflecting where you are. Do you aspire to get further to the right and become an analytics competitor? Absolutely. But I do not want to imply judgment against this. It is an evolution for every organization, and you might oscillate, as you go. So very quickly, step one, analytics hopeful, just getting the data right. A doer, you're creating context and meaning around the data. So you're generating insight on an event-driven basis. So just based on need in other ways, in other terms. Analytics user, so now you're generating insight on a predictable ongoing basis, and it's primarily for the executive audience. And finally, analytics competitor, you're not only doing it for executive audience, but you're doing it throughout the organization. You've operationalized the insight through the distribution and use of tools. So yeah, I would really hope that we're all aspiring to do this at scale, something that's sustainable, pardon me, and something that is fast, because that is absolutely critical. So if I take this same model and I look at what's been happening over the past 2 months, there are many people, analytics leaders and teams that have just risen phenomenally, both in terms of the impact that they've delivered and their visibility within the organization. And it's been beautiful to see. And they've shared their stories, and they'll share their stories here over the next couple of days, and they shared them stories yesterday. There are those, however, who are dropping off, and they're largely irrelevant. And it breaks my heart. It makes me feel that I haven't done my job better. Of course, that's very egotistical because I can't control everything. But what I will say is that there is, I'm observing, a bit of a tipping point. So if you as an organization have not adopted these platforms and created processes and built relationship equity with decision makers, then the idea that you're going to all of a sudden show up, on a horse and save the day is not a realistic expectation. That being said, if you're starting to slide down, how do you get back up? I would certainly think about the first 6 resets, if you will, as a means and get started, focusing on the platform, or actually focusing first on the appropriate data and asking the appropriate questions even before that. So more to share, I'm sure, in the discussion on that. So another way to look at it, the data change process, and I'm not going to go through it the whole way in the interest of time, but suffice to say, there's data to insights. And that's been kind of a buzz term, if you will, in our discipline, and certainly insights to action. But I want to split those two because it's not one and the same. There is the discipline of working with technology and the data within those technologies to analyze data, build tools, and distribute those tools at scale. There's another thing to take insight and actually drive action through communication, effective storytelling, effective visualizations, and so forth. There is an and in there, but there needs to be connection. So some are strong, some aren't. But I see the gap here around packaging and storytelling and communication. And that means first 2, then what? First 2, then what? At the end of the day, we got to be faster. We got to do this at speed, at scale. So with that, I want to bring David back on, and let's talk about this, David, because I am both daunted by what I just shared and excited. What are your impressions? Because I went fast as I tend to do in the morning, but I have no excuse given it's 1:40 in the morning.
Um, have you ever presented at 1:30 in the morning before?
I have not. How'd I do? Did I was I legible? I could have been talking the whole time and not not known if I was being heard by anybody.
Oh, you did great.
So
You did great.
audience
And
of one. Usually there's a resounding applause. Usually for you coming back on and me stopping, but we'll take it.
I mean, what it suggests to
No,
me, the I'm with you and Jonathan on this. I don't particularly like maturity models either, but the shift towards people analytics 3.0, clearly we saw a great example of that yesterday with Thomas Rasmussen and Sally Smith from NAB, and we could see the value, the enhanced value that they were providing to their organization. I know of others, as you said, on that curve that haven't been able to step up to the plate, and that's partly because they, as you said, they don't have the equity of stakeholders maybe already there. So there's still maybe that uncertainty or lack of awareness within some of those organizations of what people analytics can actually do. And they've not been able to step up to the plate for that. So I think that was an interesting, because I kind of been thinking that in my head as well, because most of the organizations that I speak to are probably companies that have embedded people analytics for quite some time, and as you say, they're doing some fantastic work for their businesses, but also their workforces. And with some of those things that you talked about, really, that whole thing around listening and actioning, and then measuring what the action is, and then nuancing the questions that are being asked depending on the feedback that they're getting from employees, basically, in this situation. So yeah, some really good stuff there, Al.
well, yeah, thank you. And I know you're biased, so I'll take it with a grain of salt. But I will say this is that, as we, and I'm going to share my screen again just so everyone can see the seven. Um, so what I just want to ask you, because you are obviously curating a lot of research and talking to many of the Insight 222 member companies, as am I, is your thoughts on the ethics and as the curation of these external data sets. What are you seeing, happening? Are they getting closer to the chief privacy officer, or do you see, kind of a more concerted discussion across disciplines happening than was the case historically?
It's a great topic, isn't it? Because clearly some of the examples that you showed, who actually owns that data, and one wonders if this whole situation is going to start accelerating the process where inevitably the data will be owned by the individual themselves, and
Right.
maybe that's somewhere that we're going to get to. But yes, I do. What I have seen in the companies that we're working with is, yes, that real cross functional collaboration on bringing these data sources together, and undoubtedly that is involving the chief privacy officer, or the equivalent within these companies as well. And I think that a lot of the data obviously is being aggregated. We heard yesterday from Thomas and Sally that if you're a manager, you can only see the data if you've got more than 5 people in your team. So those sorts of controls that are in place. I think it's good that people analytics teams are playing a leading role in this in many organizations, because I think they are the people, along with they're the people that are more sensitive around, I think, you know, the individual's data, perhaps, than maybe other parties within companies typically. So I think that is good, and certainly, I mean, the examples that we saw yesterday, you could see that privacy and ethics were at the forefront of thinking around some of the creative
Yeah.
ways that companies and people analytics teams are responding to this crisis. So I think that's good to see. We talked about before you started, really, the importance of ethics and putting ethics charters and processes in place to try and enable that.
Well, yeah, one thing I want to emphasize and get your comment on as well is point three: appropriate questions, appropriate data. Because again, many in our discipline have been content or tried to use data that is available to them, and increasingly, particularly given COVID-19, the data isn't appropriate. In other words, like the survey questions around engagement. If you're asking standard engagement questions, you're not going to make many friends right now. There has to be appropriate questions, which are going to generate appropriate data, which in turn are going to inspire appropriate action. Is that something that you're seeing as well among companies that are truly elevating and delivering good impact?
Yeah, I mean, and I suggest those people who are listening and watching, do check out an article by Laura Stevens from Deloitte around this, and talked about that shift in questions from engagement to well-being, and specifically around mental health and connectedness. Really good piece, and Laura Stevens, she's on you can find her on LinkedIn, the article she published there. But yes, I am seeing that within companies. I think we had a debate last week with a number of our clients at Insight 222 around this kind of notion of rally to the flag. Those employees are fortunate to still have jobs and haven't been furloughed. In a crisis, if you ask them how engaged they are, they're probably going to tell you that they're more engaged because actually they're displeased they've still got a job, to be perfectly honest with you. And if you're comparing your engagement score now to your engagement score at the end of last year, then you're certainly not comparing apples with apples. So yeah, we definitely seeing a lot of people now asking questions specifically around remote working, if you are remote working, or if you're a key worker that's still having to either be out there in the coalface, or still working in the office because of the work that you're doing, or in a supermarket, for example. Then clearly the questions that you would want to ask there would be different. I'm seeing examples of organizations actually using passive data sources such as town hall data from town halls, data from calls to HR service centers, IT service centers, and using that to understand what are the key themes that are concerning their workforce, and then designing surveys appropriately that respond to those questions. And I think we're seeing, from the vendor community, and a lot of them are our partners in this particular 3 days, we're seeing that they have designed surveys specifically around this crisis, and many of their clients are able to take those up, obviously, and use those. So yeah, I'm seeing a myriad of different ways of doing that, but I certainly see that the companies that are doing this well are doing exactly what you're saying, the seen, heard, and empowered bit, and observing, asking questions, and presenting ideas. So I think that's good to see.
Well, thanks. And I want to, as we start to wrap up, I want to go back to point one and wrap it with point six, because people and us as human beings, we have certain needs. We need to connect. We have the need to contribute, and the fact that we are struggling right now is something that not only needs to be, there needs to be empathy and compassion, but action. And we are going to be designing new workflows. We're going to be adopting new tools, obviously Zoom being one, the transcription of meetings, making them putting them in a database that's more easily accessible. I mean, there's, who's going to actually go back to an office versus, stay at home. I mean, we're going into a state where I don't believe it's a new normal. I believe it is going to be a perpetual change. And, that's not very confidence inspiring, I think. But if it is a reality that emerges, I think it's best that we prepare for it. And again, I believe people analytics and those who are managing people data have a unique opportunity to lead the discussion, as opposed to be passive and just be subjected to what comes down the pipe. So that's my feeling. Any closing thoughts, David?
Other than say, great job, Al. And I think this crisis is elevating people analytics. Certainly, it's creating opportunities, I think, for people analytics, and it seems a bit trite to say that in a crisis like this. But I think it's accelerating some of the work as well. And I think you talked about workforce planning. I think Blair had a great analogy yesterday where he said that workforce planners are suddenly as much in demand as supermarket drivers. And, you can certainly see that within organizations. And we know from many of the teams that we work with that workforce planning and people analytics has been incorporated together. And we're, after the commercial break, we'll hear from Patrick Coolan around the work that his team are doing around employee experience. So it is kind of bringing all this stuff together, and that kind of humanizing the human experience is something that a lot of people analytics teams are heavily involved in, and I think that's a good thing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, David, thank you very much. Super appreciate you. And go to commercial break now, yeah? And see you in 10 minutes. See you at the top of the hour.
Top of the hour.
Thank you.